Real quick before we get into the video, I'm very close to hitting 50,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and I would love to make that happen. So while you're watching this video, if you like what you hear, consider subscribing. I've been looking forward to seeing how the Pathless was going to turn out for a while now. So when Alex Preston from Heart Machine, the lead developer for Hyper Light Drifter, said that it was a must-play, I knew that I was going to be in for a wild ride, because Hyper Light Drifter is a masterpiece, so this man understands quality. The Pathless is an open-world adventure game that heavily leans into the innovations made to the genre by Breath of the Wild and heavily focuses on movement. It's a game about shooting a bow, having a bird, and going fast. I see a lot of people nowadays accuse open-world games like this one of just being Breath of the Wild, but I don't think these people know what they even mean when they say that, to the point where if your game has a hang glider in it, all of a sudden it's a Zelda clone. In order to try and solve this annoying problem, I'm going to try to explain what I think Breath of the Wild specifically brought to the table so that we can identify it in Pathless and also identify it in future games, so I don't have to read 700 ding-dongs telling me that every game with tall buildings is a fraudulent attempt at copying Nintendo. Feel free to skip this part of the video if you want to just get right into the review, but it's going to provide a lot of context for points I'll make later. I'll try to keep this as brief as possible. Breath of the Wild, for as massive of a game as it is, surprisingly only really did two things that give it the general vibe that it has. The first one is complete freedom of movement, and the second one is an extremely limited scope in game features that allows for very concise design. Most open-world games sort of have freedom of movement. You're usually more or less free to go wherever you want, but Breath of the Wild took things to a new level by giving the player extremely high degrees of vertical movement with its climbing and gliding mechanics. This is actually a lot more difficult in terms of game design to pull off than you're thinking. It's extremely hard to design a game where the player can literally go wherever they want as soon as the tutorial is over. Pacing this kind of thing is a nightmare. How are you going to scale enemies? How are you going to scale item drops? You need to walk a delicate balance between players feeling like they can go wherever they want and also feeling like they have actual character progression. Nintendo was able to walk this line because of the way enemy scaling works and by smart shrine placement, and prove that, yeah, you can make a coherent game where the player can literally go directly to the final boss like an hour in. The second thing Breath of the Wild changed the game with is its very condensed design, which is also one of the biggest criticisms that gets levied against it. If you're cynical enough while playing this game, eventually you'll notice that there is a very clear formula being executed. You've got shrines, you've got Korok puzzles, you've got a couple big dungeons, and you've got combat encounters. Korok puzzles are mostly a very strict set of the same types of puzzle. Shrines and dungeons are also mostly a very strict execution of the same types of puzzles, and most combat encounters play out as kill pigmen to unlock box. You are also given access to all of your tools for puzzle solving at the very start of the game, which meant that the developers had complete freedom to place whichever puzzles wherever they wanted without needing to worry about where it actually was or why, which is one of the key reasons why this game is able to have so many shrines and 5 billion Korok puzzles scattered around the map indiscriminately. This philosophy is also reflected in how enemies were designed. Breath of the Wild has an infamously small number of enemy types, specifically so that each one could be polished as much as physically possible. It's very obvious playing this game that very early on in development, Nintendo said, okay, these are the features we are going to use, these are the enemies we are going to use, no more and no less. This is what creates the feeling of repetitiveness and consistency that causes people to say things like, the game world is empty, or the game doesn't have enough content. But it's also what made it possible for this game to be so absurdly polished. If you look at any game that's being accused of being a Breath of the Wild clone, it will almost, without a doubt, be because it has high levels of vertical movement and extremely limited and concise game mechanics. That's what creates the Breath of the Wild vibe. Hopefully, now that we have covered this, we can stop calling every game with a minimap Breath of the Wild and be a little bit more accurate with our online harassment. Alright, and now that we have an understanding of how the big Zelda game works, let's move on to the Pathless. In the Pathless, you play as a hunter with a bird on a mission to save the gods and stop the God Slayer from deleting enough deities to end the world. You do this through a series of puzzles, intense car chase scenes, and big boss fights. It would probably be best to just start with setting up the game's basic mechanics. First of all, you have a bow, and it doesn't work how bows usually work in games, because you never need to actually aim at what you're shooting. The player character is always locked on to whatever object you're looking at, and provided there isn't a solid object in the way and you hold the button long enough to draw the string, she's going to hit it. At first glance, this seems like an odd choice. How are you going to make a game feel challenging or engaging if the arrow just automatically lands on its target almost every time? The answer to that is that literally the entire game from start to finish is designed around the premise that she don't miss, presumably with a few clapping emojis. So let's take a look at what you can do with these bow mechanics. First, this game's movement system is completely bow-based, which is insane, but true. Scattered all around the island, you're going to find these red talismans. If you shoot one, you will get a burst of speed if you're moving that can be converted into a long jump if you're in the air. Moving quickly across the game world requires that you time your shots accordingly and take the right path to maximize how long you can sustain your speed boosts by shooting talismans. Later, there are also these blue talismans that will launch you vertically and allow for some pretty bonkers platforming sections. I would compare this movement system to the PS4 Spider-Man in terms of how fun it is to use. There were a lot of times where I would be so focused on moving around the map in the coolest way possible that I would just forget where I was going altogether, which is a good sign that your movement system is extremely high tier. You can also use your eagle to glide and eventually just straight up fly around the map, but it never feels as fun as moving via talismans. This is basically the only issue that I had with movement overall. Once you've upgraded the eagle enough and have the ability to flap more than about 5 or 6 times, flying around the map kind of makes a lot of talisman placement feel trivial, particularly in the final area where the blue talismans show up. I wish this game would have leaned a little bit more in favor of platforming with talismans and leaned away slightly from the flight mechanics, but vertical freedom of movement is also amazing in an open world game like this, so I guess it's sort of win-win. And if you're like me and just think the talisman system is more fun, you're free to travel around the map like this if you want. I'm also pretty sure that it's usually faster than gliding in most circumstances. It also shouldn't come as a shock to find out that because of how movement works in this game, the 3 main areas can be finished in whatever order the player wants to finish them in. The final area is only unlocked after the first 3 have been cleared, but other than that, you have total agency. If you watched the Breath of the Wild recap at the start of this video, you can already tell how it heavily inspired this movement system. Replace climbing and gliding with eagle flight, and replace going fast with talismans with going fast on a horse, and we are officially halfway to being issued a cease and desist notice by Nintendo. The next thing you'll need to do with the bow is solve this game's almost entirely bow-themed puzzles. And since the character never misses, the issue isn't hitting your targets, the issue is setting up everything required to pull off the wacky trick shot. Ricocheting an arrow off a mirror or shooting it through several rings to hit a target is easy, but you need to figure out how to move all these things into place to begin with. Similar to Breath of the Wild giving you bombs, magnets, ice stuff, and time stuff as your 4 major building blocks for puzzle solving, The Pathless similarly condenses its puzzle solving into 4 pieces. You have pressure plates, torches, rings, and weights that will all need to be manipulated to solve puzzles. The best and most complex sections of the game will utilize all of these, and it's a lot of fun putting all the pieces together. Solving puzzles will get you one of 2 things, either an emblem, which are the most important collectible in the game, or gems, the item you use to upgrade your bird's flying capabilities. Usually the more complicated puzzles will require a lot of different trick shots and will give you an emblem, and the more simplified ones will give you some gems. The gem puzzles are essentially this game's version of Korok puzzles. There are several specific archetypes you'll notice, from finding and shooting a hidden talisman to following certain patterns in the environment, and several more I won't spoil. Now that the puzzles have been explained, you should be able to see how we have met both requirements to be labeled as a 1-to-1 remake of Breath of the Wild by the biggest-brained observers. Puzzles have been boiled down to an extremely concise set of mechanics, and movement has been completely opened up in all 3 dimensions. It's actually kind of impressive how Nintendo was able to condense this game's magic into 2 design choices, and equally impressive that the team working on the Pathless was able to accurately diagnose exactly what the magic was and how to replicate it. That being said, now that I think I've pointed out what gives Breath of the Wild its energy, we can all see how stupid it is calling everything a Breath of the Wild clone. Every game with gliding and puzzles isn't a Breath of the Wild clone any more than any game with a man who jumps is a Mario clone. And even if they were, this is how game design has always progressed. Someone comes along and has a really good idea, and then that really good idea becomes a formula that defines an entire genre or subgenre. This entire bit has just been a desperate ploy to get all of you to stop commenting on my Cube World video saying it's Breath of the Wild. Please stop. That's all I wanted. That's the entire purpose of this video. So, you've managed to Hawkeye your way through enough puzzles and have a bunch of these emblems I was talking about earlier. And now what? Emblems are used to activate towers around the map that will weaken the angry god in the area enough for you to fight them, which is how you progress the story. Boss fights in the game are all absolutely incredible. After a god is weakened, you need to chase it down, which involves pushing the movement system to its limit to keep up with them, so you can shoot out all their legs to stop them from running. These chase sequences are some of the most fun parts of the game, and it was always the thing that I looked forward to after clearing an area. I really wish the game had some sort of time trial or option to replay these chases, because they would be really fun to try to speedrun or something. After you've chased down the boss, you'll move into a more traditional boss arena for a more traditional boss fight. Each god has a completely unique arena and fight sequence that keeps them from ever feeling repetitive, and they all have awesome designs. My only complaint about the bosses is that you can only fight them once per playthrough, which should be all I need to say in terms of the quality of their design. That pretty much puts a bow on the gameplay of Pathless. It's an extremely open-ended, very well polished and executed adventure game about being really good with a bow and petting birds. All of my gripes about this game are basically just me wanting more of its finer aspects. More boss fights, more platforming sequences, more complex puzzles, and this is all a good sign, because like some guy said at some point, you should always leave the audience wanting more. Now that we have covered mechanics, we can move on to some of the other aspects of this game's design. The art style for the Pathless is in the same vein as several of my all-time favorite video game art styles. It's a style that sort of invokes the feeling of a low-poly indie game, but in reality is very sharp and detailed. I also really appreciated the use of color, both in terms of the way the character is designed and in some of the more colorful areas of the game, like the fall birch forests. After all the bright colors and the amazing art style, the next thing you'll notice about the Pathless is its incredible feeling of scale. Just to show how serious this game is at imparting on you just how huge the island is, here's the game's opening shot. The entire game world is also seamlessly connected, and anywhere you can see on the island is a place you can go, which, when coupled by how far the camera pulls back when you're flying, can create some pretty impressive feelings of grandiosity. The landscape is also extremely well designed from the perspective of gameplay. This game has no map, so you need to navigate the world on your own, but everything is so clearly visible from high vantage points that you can easily read the terrain as if it was a map in the first place. There was never a time where I felt lost or felt like I needed a map, and it probably took me until about halfway through the game before it even occurred to me that I didn't have one. As far as story goes, this is a very solid hero's journey. There are a lot of fun themes and pieces of lore you can piece together by reading stone monuments and talking to ghosts. Most of the game's theming revolves around questioning your faith, questioning what direction you're moving in, and coming to terms with the idea that maybe the best path to enlightenment is to have no path at all. It's very existential and probably pretty heavily influenced by Eastern philosophy, which tends to take on a more relaxed, go-with-the-flow type attitude. Speaking of real-life influences, I've started to realize that the niche that I am accidentally kind of carving out for myself on YouTube is one of really getting into analyzing what real-life histories and mythologies are going into inspiring the games that I'm talking about. I've done a lot of that in the past on this channel, and I really got a lot of positive feedback for my analysis of Transient in my last video, so I figured it wouldn't be that bad of an idea to wrap up this video by going into a little bit of some interesting real-life shenanigans that are going on, influencing the general tone and feel of the Pathless. Right off the bat, on the title screen of the Pathless, you're going to get hit with some good old-fashioned throat singing. If you're familiar with this type of singing, then you probably know that it generally comes from Mongolia and some of the surrounding regions, which is very much the part of the world that inspired pretty much every aspect of this game. Mongolia is kind of famous historically for a few things. Doing horses really good, doing archery really good, and doing falconry really good. So it's not really that shocking that if your plan is to make a game about being really good with a bow while moving fast and having a bird, this is probably the vibe you're generally going to pick up on in your research. You'll also notice that the eagle in the Pathless is very clearly designed to be similar to a golden eagle, the classic bird used for falconry in this part of the world. You can also see the influence of all this history in the design of the player character if you're looking hard enough. The gods also seem to somewhat be inspired by this part of the world. The faiths and mythologies from this area are very complex, so I don't think there are any direct analogs to what's found in the Pathless, but spirits in this game take on sort of an animistic / shamanistic role in the game world, which is more or less how the traditional belief systems of Mongolia shake out in real life. Animism is a term that you don't really hear that often, but its definition is basically attributing a spirit to plants, objects, or other natural phenomenon. Looking at a totally hypothetical example, let's say you're a guy in a tribe and you're looking around trying to figure out how the fuck anything works. You look at the forest and you think, okay, a bunch of our food comes from the forest. That's pretty important. There must be some kind of spirit here. I bet it's like an elk or something. I see a lot of elk in the forest. Then your tribe makes their living trading various pottery and ceramic goods they make, so you think, Okay, fire is pretty cool, and it helps us make these big urns. It probably has a spirit too. The sun is basically fire. I see a lot of lizards sitting in the sun, so I bet the fire spirit is a lizard or something. Water is good. What would a water spirit look like? Probably like a snake. Snakes are pretty river-shaped. Okay, so that mountain is pretty tall, which means it's close to the sky. And the sky is definitely important, because that's where the sun is, and also sometimes where the nighttime sun is. So the mountain definitely has to have a soul. The most badass thing I've ever seen in the mountains was a bear, so surely the mountain spirit is a bear. Hopefully this totally unrelated example is making some sense. That basically wraps up things for the Pathless. I would recommend this game to anyone who wants to play an extremely relaxing adventure, and would especially recommend it to more casual players. Plus, it was given a good review by Alex Preston, and come on, this guy fucking knows what a good game is. If you want to see more videos like this one, consider subscribing. Likes and comments are also very helpful. You should also follow me on Twitter so you don't miss any important updates. And finally, you can join the Discord community with the link I have down in the description, and get access to our Minecraft server. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.